facts of history, but that one personalized assignment is what really sticks in their minds. And so if we can just get them, and you can do this, if you have grandchildren out there, tell the stories of your experiences. Share those. If you have children out there, see if anything can be done to get more local history into our schools, because it's badly lacking. Thank you.
I think we should give a round of applause to all the authors before we start questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, anyone that has any questions for the authors, if you would mind going to the microphone in the middle aisle so that everyone can hear the questions, we'd appreciate that at this time. Any takers? Okay, we've got a couple, so we'll just give you a couple minutes to get out there.
While we're waiting for them to come up there, I did not tell you, I forgot to tell you about how my grandfather survived the Cherry Mine disaster. I had started out on a detective hunt for a man and ended up finding this story. And just about the time that the book was being finished, my mother said, "Oh, you know how Grandpa Tintori survived the Cherry Mine disaster?" And I said, "Hello?" And she said, "Oh, he was drunk and didn't go to work that day." The story was he wasn't much of a drinker. This was uncharacteristic. But he was 22 years old, and in the book, I do have a mistake. I had said that he had been here a couple of months. I've been looking and looking and looking to try to find his ship papers of when he came over. And last year, a fellow Italian genealogist found it for me. He landed in Ellis Island 18 days before the Cherry Mine disaster. So if you figure how many days it took to process the men through, the immigrants through, and how long it would take to take a train from New York to Chicago and then into Cherry, he just showed up at his Aunt Beatrice Galetti's house a few days and was a brand new guy in the Cherry Mine.
And it was the best drink he ever had.
I'm going to remember that line.
There's another thing I want to add, and there's a special lady here tonight. Her name is Eleanor Hanneman, and she came to our house when we were doing our book. And again, you know, we're not literary experts. I'm an engineer, I'm factual, I dot my I's and cross my T's. And we had thoughts one time about not even doing this book. Eleanor came over, and she read our material. She started going through it, and she says, "Dean, Lorena, I'm going to work with you, and we're going to put this together because it's a story that needs to be told, and I'm going to help you do this." She looked at the pictures that we had, especially my wife's grandfather, and she said, "What a handsome man." She said, "Look at those eyes." She said, "You can tell he's got fight in him," and he does, and he did. And that's what kept him alive all those years, especially through World War I, through the disasters. And Eleanor, thank you so much for coming tonight.
Stand up, Eleanor.
My question was, how did they rescue the people that were down for 8 days? Did they have to dig another shaft, or did they use some of the existing shafts to get to those people?
Well, what happened was they had sealed over the mine. In order to try to put out the fire, the only way that they could decide to do it was that they had to seal over both shafts. If you can imagine, your loved ones are still down there and you're watching them put sheet metal and wood and sand and concrete and burying them alive. And the safety guys, the guys that came in from the U.S. Geological Survey, would periodically were testing, putting doctors, mouth thermometers down to see what the temperature was, unsealing a little bit to see if any gas came out, if any smoke came out. And what had happened was a search party went down looking for bodies, looking to see if there were rock falls. And the 8-day guys, they were dying of thirst, and one of them, who was an asthmatic, was on his last leg, and they had eaten their belts and everything. And so they broke through the tunnel. Some of them were in a desperate search saying, maybe there's some water down here that they had left for the mules. and they were on a search for water. And the other people were down looking to retrieve bodies, and they met up on the road. And actually, one of the men, Antonio Quartaroli, his brother-in-law, his wife's brother, actually, you know, they came face to face, and it was just like a miracle, and the shout went up top. Well, at first they said there are hundreds of them alive, and there, you know, it was a bad report, but it was only the 20 of them. And then the asthmatic, unfortunately, he lived only 48 hours. He went home and was reunited with his family only to die 48 hours later.
This has been alluded to, I think, earlier, but depending upon our ages, the Pearl Harbor disaster, Kennedy's assassination, 9/11, all changed our lives. One day life was this way, the next day was the other way. We've heard, for the people of Cherry, of course, November 13th, 1909 was one of those days. We know a lot about the widows and children, the women who lost husbands, brothers, and fathers, the children who lost their brothers and fathers in this. What about the men who survived? How did they deal with this tragedy from this day forward, from November 13th on? I know many of you have male relatives, you know, who survived. How did they deal with this tragedy? Did it change their personalities and the way they looked at life?
In this particular case, I've heard stories also. There was supposedly one man from that Cherry mine disaster that was never accounted for. And later, I think they found out that on the day of that disaster, he just left Cherry. And they found that he immediately got on a ship and went back to Europe. Other people would never go back in that mine. It all depends on the person, the man. They still had to make their livings. Luciano was one of them. He went back in that mine and worked after the disaster until he goes back to Italy when the mine went on strike. He comes back 2 additional times to work in that mine. It takes a certain type of person with a certain type of personality. Me, I couldn't do it. His son, Primo, worked a half a day. He wasn't going to go back in there. So a lot of it depends on the family situations, who you are, and you will do what you have to do. You look at the guys on 9/11, the firefighters. They responded. And the same thing goes, it's no different today than it was back then. A lot of people, her parents or grandparents, they maybe worked a while, they went to Detroit. Attilio Corsini, he went back in the mines, he worked. He worked all the way up to the time when Primo came back in 1929. And my wife wants to say something.
I was just going to say, you know, stop and think about it. There was no such thing as counseling, you know, with the survivors. I mean, who are they going to talk to? Probably, maybe in their own ethnic group. But they just went on with their lives. That's about how it was. I mean, people were pretty tough back then. And, you know, today it's,
One of the stories that struck me was Alexander Rosenjack. Alexander Rosenjack was one of the young men who offloaded that hay cart. And he was one of the guys who kept going. He was not on the fateful last cage, but he kept going back down there. And he was crazed with trying to help them. And at one point, he went down there, he knew where there was a hose down there, and he had people tie a rope to him, and he was like a crazy man going to go in there with the hose and fight the fire. And when the people with him saw how bad it was, they pulled him back. And he left town. Whether the mine company escorted him out of town, and for a long time, nobody knew where Rosenjack was. Well, about the time he ended up actually in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I found actually Jack Rooney, I guess it was, there was a death notice in the paper. And so this is a man who, if you can imagine, talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome and wondering what he went through all of those years. Well, it ended up, and it's the last line in my book, which I didn't write. My husband actually wrote it. He was standing behind me. And I'm going like, I just got to figure out what's the last line? And he said, Alexander Rosenjack was a fireman. So that's how he dealt with his demons all of those years.
And remember, the vast majority of the survivors went right back into the coal mine. There were some who didn't, but the vast majority of them did.